Hello. Today we're going to talk about the 1930s, the decade of the Great Depression. We often talk about the Great Depression in terms of the United States, and it certainly was a traumatic time in the United States. However, the Great Depression actually was a worldwide depression. The U.S. was not the only country experiencing the hard times. We are going to focus on the U.S. today, but it is important to know that this is a depression that went, or at least started, throughout the developed economies of the world. Again, I'm going to forego reading the big ideas and guiding questions. Those are in your textbook. Please make sure you do pay attention to those as they will help guide you in your reading. Republicans were very happy to accept the credit for the prosperity during the 1920s, the time of economic prosperity, the time of partying, the time of the feel-good era. The Republicans were very happy to accept the responsibility for that, the credit for that. However, when the stock market crashes, they really don't want to take the blame for that. There's a Republican in the presidency, Herbert Hoover, and he is actually going to take the blame for the stock market crash and the onset of the Great Depression. So, and he really doesn't deserve the blame. Obviously, he had not even been in office for a year. So how much of it could have really been his fault? But he was the one who was in office at the time. And so he was the one people were looking to for immediate relief. And when that immediate relief did not come, when there wasn't a quick fix, he got the blame. It took about a year for the unemployment, poverty, and despair to be widespread. So when the stock market first crashes, we have this idea that as soon as it crashes, everything becomes desolate and awful, and everybody falls on hard times immediately. It's not immediate. It takes about a year for it to become widespread. But within 1 year, the Depression is hitting pretty much everybody. Hoover did not actually want to call it a panic or a crisis. Previous economic slumps have been called panics or crises. There was one in the 1890s, and those had a very negative connotation. So he's actually the one who said, let's call it a depression. He thought that calling it a depression would make it sound less scary. It would stir up less negative emotions, and this would help keep the American people a little more positive. So he called it a depression. Now today, a depression sounds awful to us, but that's because of how vast and widespread and how extensive the Great Depression was. The fundamental business of the country, that is production and distribution of commodities, is on a sound and prosperous basis. That's what President Hoover said October 25th of 1929. Just 4 days later, the bottom is going to fall out of the stock market. So, what does Hoover actually do? Well, he does a couple of things. First, he tries to offer words of encouragement. He realizes that people are looking to him to kind of guide their reaction to all of this, and so he tries to give words of encouragement. He did get the government involved, not to the extent that a lot of people thought that he should, but he did get the government involved. He got them involved in federal public works, which is where the government would spend money on public works projects, roads, bridges, things that would benefit the entire public. The federal government would put money out and pay for those things to be done. This would help create jobs. That was the idea. And then by creating these jobs, people would have the money to spend to put back into the economy. He also instituted tax cuts. He said by cutting taxes, that would leave more money in people's pockets, and then they would have more disposable income to put into the economy and buy things, creating more of a demand, which would then create an increase in supply, resulting in more jobs. And so he tried to do several of these things. There was a Revenue Act. Several things were put into place to try and encourage people's confidence in the economy, try and encourage people to spend a little bit more money, to have some money in order to spend. This is a chart of unemployment from 1920 to 1942. You can see it was way down in the 20s. It peaked right here in about 21, 22. That's when the war industries were phasing out and there was a transition going on. Then it really goes down. 26, it's very low. 1929, it was on the decline again until the Great Depression hits. And then by 1933, it's at an all-time high. 1939, there's also going to be another spike, but that's quickly going to start going down as we build up to go into World War II. So Hoover says, well, the first thing we need to do is we need to talk to the business community, talk to the business executives and get them to voluntarily cooperate, get them to voluntarily do things to help us out. So he talked to people like Milton Hershey and said, please don't lay off your workers. Please keep your workers. He talked to the railroad tycoons, Rockefeller and Vanderbilt and all of these big industrialists that we've studied. He talked to a lot of them and he talked them into not laying people off, not stopping production or slowing down production right away. Or at least if they did slow down production, don't lay the people off. Just hold on. And the businesses really did try to cooperate, but they could only do that for so long. So as the economic reality set in, the businessmen finally had to start laying people off, had to start saying, we can't continue to produce at this level. The Federal Farm Board, this plan was put into place to try and help the farmers in that, but as the price of food, as the price of crops continued to fall, the Farm Board really couldn't do anything. You had the PECE and the POUR. These were, again, relief efforts, attempts to coordinate relief efforts, but they didn't have the resources that were necessary. So there were things that were trying to be done, but all of the pieces weren't in place at the time to get them done. National Credit Corporation showed a desire for banks to form a corporation, but trying to stabilize the banking industry, trying to kind of bring them together because they'd be stronger in a group than individually, but that's not going to work either. So these are all attempts that Hoover made, but again, all the pieces aren't going to be in place for this to work. Hoover believed that it was the duty of the private individuals, not the government, to help the needy. He said it's not the government's job to provide welfare to its citizens. That is the private citizen's job. And that's really what the Bible tells us. It's the church's job to provide help to the needy. The public outcry for more government help, though, was mounting rapidly. People were looking to their government. It's a trend that began with the Progressive Era. They were looking to their government to take care of their problems. So Hoover did believe that if the government was going to be involved, he believed that work relief was acceptable. Now, work relief means people would work to get the money that they were being paid. He didn't believe in welfare, or what they called it dole at the time. They didn't believe in dole, no work for money. They didn't think that it was okay to get paid, or Hoover didn't think it was okay to get paid or collect money from the government for not doing any work. So he believed in work relief, and he tried to put some of those programs in place. But he said it really needs to be under state and local government. The state and local governments really need to put these things into place. He wanted to avoid deficit spending. He said, we don't need to make bad economic decisions here. We don't need to be spending more than we have. We already have a debt issue. Then the Smoot-Hawley tariff was the highest in American history. We talked about this in the last lecture. It majorly taxed imports from Europe and other nations, and then those nations answered by putting high tariffs on American goods. So it actually closes the markets that might still have been open for American goods. Then there was an economic collapse in Europe in 1931. They had been part of this cycle of debt as well. They had had economic issues of their own, and their economies are going to collapse in 1931. And so because of that, a moratorium is put on any European debt repayments. So the money that the Europeans owed to the United States was not coming in now either. Then you had the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was able to lend money to banks and large businesses, but they were criticized because it looked like they were only helping the wealthy. So Hoover's actions actually set a precedent for more government involvement in the American economy. Now, Hoover was not a proponent of a lot of government involvement in the economy, but something needed to be done. And so he sets the precedent for the government to become involved. But it's too little, too late. He had made big promises when he was being elected, a car in every driveway, a chicken in every pot, but he wasn't able to deliver on those promises. And people saw themselves as much more worse off after Hoover's first term than at the beginning of his term. So they demanded change. They wanted action. The GDP dropped from $104 billion to $41 billion in just 4 years. A lot of people had no income at all. So they wanted change. They wanted something done. And Hoover was a good one to blame because he was the face of the American government at the time. And then you have the Bonus Army. The Bonus Army are World War I veterans. They had been promised a bonus payment that would come due in 1945. So they were told in 1945 you're going to get the bonus payment. You're going to get some money. Well, they didn't think they could wait till 1945. They said we need money now, and they tried to get Congress to pass a law giving them their money now, giving them their money in the early 1930s, give it to them early. And Congress didn't pass that. Hoover also would not meet with them or with their representatives. And he winds up, some veterans and their families go to D.C. They've been there trying to lobby Congress, trying to meet with Hoover. Hoover won't meet with them. Congress won't pass the bill. And they've kind of set up this little encampment. Well, something needs to be done to get them out of D.C. to move the encampment. Hoover didn't want to hurt them or run them out. He wanted to make sure that things were not disintegrating into abhorrent conditions. But General MacArthur goes in and he actually drives the veterans out of the city and burns their shanty town. General MacArthur is known for flamboyant actions, and so instead of going in and just encouraging them to move on, he takes a very heavy hand. Hoover does take full responsibility for that. He's the commander-in-chief. General MacArthur would then be under his command, and he winds up appearing to be heartless. So in the election of 1932, Republican prospects were bleak. There wasn't really anybody that the Republicans could put up that would have a strong showing. Hoover's renominated, but everybody pretty much knows he's not going to win. The Democrats nominate Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He had been governor of New York, and he portrayed himself as one who challenged tradition. And as far as people were concerned, tradition hadn't gotten them anywhere. They needed something new. And so the campaign kind of sets up as Hoover favors tradition, and most Americans want innovations. So Roosevelt promises a New Deal. Now, he doesn't give a lot of specifics. He just says that the American people deserve a New Deal, and he's going to give it to them. He's playing off of Teddy Roosevelt's Square Deal. So people heard what they wanted to hear, and so they elected by a landslide Franklin Roosevelt in 1932. You can see only a few states even went for Herbert Hoover. In the final days of his administration, after the election but before Roosevelt's inauguration, it's about 4 months that Hoover had in office, and he tried to enlist Roosevelt's help in dealing with the economic issues. But Roosevelt didn't want anything to do with it, because if anything that they did at that time failed, he wanted it all to be on Herbert Hoover. And so he avoided helping with anything there. The banking crisis began to sweep the country. This is where people started thinking that they needed to get their money out of the banks. The banks weren't stable. At this point, there wasn't a huge amount of regulation on banks, and so people were afraid that banks would shut down. And if they shut down, then the people would lose their money. It had happened before. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt is inaugurated in 1933, and in his inaugural address, he says, "First of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And I'm sure you've heard that before. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. It's comes from his Franklin Roosevelt's first inaugural address in 1933, and he's specifically talking about the economy. So how is he going to fight fear? Well, he calls Congress into session, and the first thing he has them do is declare a bank holiday. Now, the bank holiday, what that means is that all the banks across the nation have to close. It's mandated by the federal government. No bank can be open. And in order to reopen, the bank has to show that it is stable, that it can stay open, that it's a strong entity. And there's some criteria put forth to determine the soundness of a bank. And so all the banks are closed for several days. That stops the run on the bank. It stops everybody from coming and pulling their money out of the banks, which could make the banks unsound. Allows the experts time to go in and evaluate the soundness of the banks. And then those banks that actually are sound are allowed to reopen. Now, what this does is it instills confidence in the people who have money in these banks. So in the first 100 days of Roosevelt's administration, Congress passes Roosevelt's New Deal programs. There's an unusual amount of cooperation between Congress and FDR, and actually at one point it starts to seem like Congress is just rubber stamping anything that Roosevelt wants. The nation generally approves of what's being done because they think it's going to bring them some sort of relief. They're like, something's got to be done. We don't know what it is, but something's got to be done, and at least they're doing something. The brain trust is the term that is given to the group of people who were advising Franklin Roosevelt on economic issues at the time. They weren't an official group. They didn't meet in official meetings, but there was a group of men that Roosevelt trusted for economic advice, and they had his ear. So the Emergency Banking Act was passed the first day, and then that dealt with the bank holiday and the soundness of the banks and all of that. Roosevelt started introducing fireside chats. And I sent you a link to an example of a fireside chat. This is where he would just kind of sit down and just talk to the American people. And it was the first time a president had done that, had just addressed the American people themselves, not Congress, not big rallies or whatever. He came on the radio, so he was coming into your home as you sat by the fireplace and you were having a chat. And he would explain to you why these programs were necessary or what he was doing or how much he cared. And so it was an emotional connection. It made people feel like their president was personable and cared about them specifically. And so people began to redeposit their funds. The very first fireside chat Roosevelt did was about the banks, the bank holiday, and determining that the banks were sound. Then he began to develop his alphabet agencies, and you have some assignments that deal with the alphabet agencies. And so we're going to talk about a few of them. This may help you in those assignments. They're called the alphabet agencies because they usually all were abbreviated by 3 letters. And they had 3 main focuses: relief, recovery, or reform. So that was what their purpose was. They were either a relief agency, a recovery agency, or a reform agency. So you have the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. And this was young, unmarried men that could work for this agency. It was rigid discipline. It was a team effort. And they did a lot of different jobs. They actually helped build the Blue Ridge Parkway. But you had to be a young single man, and you could get a job with the CCC. There was also the Public Works Administration, the PWA. They built public facilities, ships, planes for the military. There were a couple other agencies, the CWA and the FERA, that provided similar work. Then you have the WPA, Works Progress Administration, and this is the group that actually did most of the work on the Blue Ridge Parkway. We wouldn't have the Blue Ridge Parkway if it wasn't for the WPA. They employed pretty much anybody, so you didn't have to be young, you didn't have to be single, you didn't have to be a man. They would employ pretty much anybody, although mostly men would have been working for these agencies. They had more than 8 million jobs, and many considered it make work. In other words, many people felt like jobs were just being created out of the blue, that this wasn't necessarily work that had to be done, but it was just something project being done to create jobs. Then you have the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which was supposed to pay farmers who plowed up cotton and slaughtered pigs. The economists, these economic advisors in the Brain Trust, realized that the more pigs that were that were raised for food, the more crops that were grown, the more the market was flooded with these items, the longer the price for these items was going to stay low. And so the way to get the price to increase to a livable wage for the farmer was to reduce the supply of these goods. And that's what this act was supposed to do. We still do that. We still give government subsidies to farmers to not grow things. This was widely criticized as seen as wasteful. The next one is the National Industrial Recovery Act. And this put forth codes, guidelines for businesses. The Blue Eagle was its symbol. The National Recovery Agency, NRA, not the same NRA we talk about today, but the National Recovery Agency was part of this act, came out of this act. The NIRA and the AAA were both declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So this and the Agricultural Adjustment Act were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Then you have the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC. This is still around today. It insured bank deposits, and it increased the public confidence in the banking system. And basically what it said is up to this amount of money, the government will guarantee that amount of money. Today it's $250,000. So if you have $250,000 or less in your bank account and your bank goes under, it closes for whatever reason, you do not lose that money. If the bank can't give you your money back, then the federal government will. And that's what the FDIC is. The next one is the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. The Tennessee Valley Authority, they built dams along the Tennessee River. And that's primarily what they did. And those dams were used to help bring electricity to many of the rural areas. Then you have the Social Security Act. The Social Security Act was assumed to be a pay-as-you-go system. The idea was that you would pay into it while you were working and young, and then when you got older, that money would come back to you. So I would be paying for my own Social Security. Now, that's not how it works today. Today, I'm paying into Social Security so that there's money to pay my mother's Social Security, because Congress actually borrowed money from the Social Security Fund and has never had the money to pay it back. But the idea was that it would be paid for as you go. Workers would pay into it while they're young enough to work, and then when they get too old to work and retire, that would be their retirement account. Then the Rural Electrification Administration, the REA, this was again another program to try and bring electricity to many of the rural areas. Now, there were some roadblocks and pitfalls to what Roosevelt was doing. Roosevelt took action, and so a lot of people approved of that. But he also received criticism. Some people said he was overreaching. He was stretching the arm of the presidency too far. He was taking on too much power. He was making decisions without knowing the consequences of those decisions. There was a lot of criticism there. But for most people, it just felt good that somebody was trying to help, and so they were accepting. So what was the opposition from the right? Well, he said it was very expensive. It sent the nation into heavy debt. There was major deficit spending. It increased government regulation. That government oversight was being increased. And they said that anytime government regulation increases, that there's a loss of freedom. And it said that the New Deal was not bringing recovery. They said none of this is working. The economy isn't recovering. So why are we going through all this if it's not working? In addition, the Supreme Court rejected some of the New Deal legislation in 1935 and 1936. Now, Roosevelt also faced opposition from the left, specifically from Senator Huey Long. He was from Louisiana, and he wrote a piece called Share Our Wealth. He said that's what Roosevelt was trying to do. He said that wasn't okay, but he wasn't around to bring up opposition for too long because he wound up being assassinated in 1935. But he was the voice from the left in opposing some of Roosevelt's ideas. Okay. So Dr. Francis Townsend proposes that the government pension be $200 a month to citizens over the age of 60, that they would have to spend it all. They couldn't save it. There were these things called Townsend clubs that they could use it for. There's a few other people. Father Charles Coughlin is a Roman Catholic priest from Michigan. Said that we should go off of the gold standard, which Roosevelt actually does take us off of the gold standard, introduces silver, deals with social justice and anti-Semitic views. You can read about some of those in your book. For the sake of time, I'm going to go on to the court packing scheme of Roosevelt. And that is, he calls it a switch in time saves 9. Now, the Congress, the Constitution sets up the judiciary branch, but it only specifically names the Supreme Court. It says that the Supreme Court has to exist, but it doesn't say how many justices have to be on the Supreme Court. It leaves it up to Congress to determine that. Congress had determined that there should be 9 justices on the Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court starts rejecting some of this New Deal legislation that Roosevelt supported, he didn't like that. And so he decided he was going to pack the court. And he tried to get Congress to change how many Supreme Court justices there needed to be. He wanted them to say for every justice over a certain age, he would also get to appoint a new justice, which would allow him to put enough justices on the Supreme Court to put his supporters in the majority and pretty much guarantee that any of his policies and programs would be deemed constitutional. However, Congress, even though Roosevelt's a Democrat and Congress is controlled by the Democrats, they do not pass this. It is seen as exactly what it is, a power play. He loses the battle over the court, but he does win the war because he stays in office long enough to wind up appointing his own nominees who approve the New Deal programs. Okay, so recovery is elusive. No matter how many New Deal programs are put into place, recovery is still not happening as quickly as maybe it should have. But many Americans have received some form of aid, and somebody is at least trying to do something, so Roosevelt remains really popular. He also just had a charisma about him, and these fireside chats really endeared him to the people. And economic conditions did seem to be improving. Recovery wasn't happening, but there was some improvement. So why mess with that? So when the 1936 election comes up, the Republicans nominate Alfred Landon. He's a Kansas governor, and he is nominated. They call him the Kansas Coolidge. They try to equate him to the calmness and the endearing qualities of Calvin Coolidge. Landon only wins 2 states, however. Roosevelt is immensely popular, and he wins in another landslide. And in his second inaugural address in 1937, he says, "I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished." So he's saying there's more work to be done, and we're going to do it. But the economy does not cooperate. There's another sharp economic decline in 1937. The New Deal isn't working, or it doesn't seem to be working. The court packing episode comes to light, and Roosevelt's reputation starts to take some hits. And labor unions start gaining strength. So the CIO is organized by John Lewis. They had broken off from the AFL. The rubber industry strikes. There's sit-down strikes where people literally just sit down. And these are actually outlawed by the Supreme Court in 1939. But they had an impact. The CIO actually becomes very powerful. It does eventually reunite with the AFL, and now we know it as the AFL-CIO. So unions begin to gain a lot of power. Let's look at what family life was like in the Great Depression. For the family, starvation was a possibility. It was a distinct possibility, especially if you lived in the cities or if you lived in the Midwest. At the same time the Depression is going on, the Midwest is being hit with huge dust storms. All the good farmland is blowing away because there's been this huge drought for a very long time, turning all of the topsoil into sand. And so you can't grow anything. There's very little water. So if you live in the Midwest, if you're a farmer in the Midwest, you can't even grow your own food. If you live in the cities anywhere else, you obviously aren't growing your own food. Now, if you lived like in this area where you could have a backyard garden and go hunting, starvation wasn't as big of an issue. It still was hard to find food, but there were things you can do. I remember hearing my grandmother and my aunt talking about peeling potatoes and putting them in the oven with surrounding a possum. And they wouldn't necessarily eat the possum, but they'd let the drippings from the possum flavor the potatoes so that they would have something to eat. And so starvation is a huge concern. There's enormous debt. Families cannot pay for things. They have no money. And so things that they had bought on credit, they still owe the money on. And so they lose homes, they lose automobiles, they lose a lot of things. There are bread lines because nobody can afford to buy food. There's bread lines where food is handed out, or soup kitchens where food is handed out. But that's humiliating to many of these people. Many of these people have been brought up that you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and you make good. Homelessness is rampant. Many people had to sell their home or abandon their home. They just couldn't afford it. About 2 million people are homeless. Many of them are living in their cars if they were able to keep their car. You have hobo jungles, which is where people have just taken whatever material they could find to make some sort of a shelter for them and their family. And many families face the threat of foreclosure if they did keep their house. Minority groups did not fare any better. About half of all African Americans were unemployed in 1932. Sharecroppers couldn't make anything, even less than what they had made before, so they moved to the cities to try and find jobs, but there were no jobs in the city. And most of the initial government relief was not aimed at the African Americans. Roosevelt's policies actually won African American voters to the Democratic Party, however, because it seemed like he would at least try to help them. This was the beginning of the African Americans strongly supporting the Democratic Party. As far as the Hispanics, many of them returned to Mexico or were deported. But there was prejudice and violence against anybody of a minority. So what did entertainment look like? Well, most people didn't have money for entertainment, but some people did. Some people didn't experience deprivation. Some people had saved money. Some people had played the stock market well, or some people lived in an area where growing food and they could kind of be self-sufficient. And so they could afford a few things for entertainment. They read a lot of books. Hollywood films were still being produced and people would still go and see them. That would be a big treat, but so people would go and see them. But the radio was a huge source of entertainment. One of the most popular programs was War of the Worlds. Sports was very popular. You'd go and watch a sports game or you could hear it on the radio. And then there were the World's Fairs in Chicago and New York, if you lived in those areas. Some people could afford to travel to them, not all of them. There was crime during the 1930s. Actually, there was an increase in crime because people were much more desperate. Charles Lindbergh, the one who'd first made the first transatlantic flight, he'd become very popular, was a bit of a celebrity. His young son, 1-year-old son, was kidnapped from his home and actually later found dead. And there was a huge trial, or a huge investigation, into what happened to the Lindbergh baby. And the sad thing is, as the kidnapper was carrying the baby down the ladder, he actually fell. And when he fell, the fall killed the baby. Bank robbing gangs were rampant. People were desperate. They needed money. And some people just used it as an opportunity. And so the Federal Bureau of Investigation was established, and J. Edgar Hoover became the first head of the FBI. During this time, however, flying was really taking off. It was really being developed more. Amelia Earhart sets out on her flight around the world. Of course, nobody knows what exactly happened to her, but she was a woman that was flying in an airplane. That was a huge deal at the time. And so she made the newspapers and radio news programs and that kind of thing. And then, of course, when she disappeared, that made the news. Will Rogers and Wiley Post were also big pilots. And then in the late 30s, the Hindenburg, which is basically a huge blimp, winds up exploding and crashing. Much of the world was struggling with the Depression in 1939. By that year, undercurrents of war were also stirring in the world's already troubled waters. So late 30s, during this time of depression, when everybody is so consumed with their own economic interest and their own economic issues, that is when Adolf Hitler is able to go into Germany and really start playing on the desperations of the people and drawing them to him and offering them a way out of their desperate situation and being able to take over Germany and then make his play for conquering other parts of Europe. I hope that this has helped you understand the 1930s a little bit better. I'll see you next time.